Hi everyone, I'm Dave, and welcome to my channel. To start with today, I'm going to talk to you about the 36 Days of Type Challenge. If it's not something that you're familiar with, I seriously suggest that you pause this video, head over to Instagram, and look up the hashtag over there. I guarantee that you'll be blown away by the overwhelming quantity and quality of work that the creative community has put together for the challenge. In 2019, I took the plunge and created my first series for the challenge. It was a unique set of geometric letter forms that I created within Illustrator. I then wanted to integrate photographic elements into the background, but I didn't want to use stock photography. So that meant a few days running around with my camera, shooting source material for the project. I then challenged myself to animate it in After Effects, even though I wasn't very familiar with motion design. So at the end of the day, I pushed myself beyond my comfort zone. And that's the beauty of this project. The premise itself is quite simple. All you need to do is create an alphabet. But there's nothing holding you back from trying something new. So this year, I created a fun set of robotic letter forms, and in this tutorial, I'll break down my process. So follow along with me as I take a very rough pencil sketch and turn it into a clean vector robotic letter form. And then imagine repeating that process 35 more times, because that's what I did. So normally at this point, I would say, let's go jump into Illustrator and get started. But that's not the case this time. This time, let's grab a pencil and a sheet of paper and get going. So to start with for this project, I was just using basic printer paper and a mechanical pencil. I wanted all of my drawings to be fairly consistent, but I didn't want to be using rulers to accomplish that. So I jumped into Illustrator, set up 6 square guides on a piece of paper, printed it out, and then I was able to drop that in behind my blank paper and use that as a really rough guide to work towards so that all my characters stayed the same size and shape. So once I had these simple guides set up, it was time to start building my characters. The guides allowed me to keep everything consistent, and that's good because I'm not a great traditional artist. That being said, I still had a lot of fun putting these together. I sketched out the basic shape and ideas that I was trying to capture with each character. In some cases, one take was all it took. Other times I needed to go back to the drawing board, start again because proportions were off and things weren't looking great. But once I was happy with the way a character looked, I pulled out my phone, launched the photo app, and took just a simple snapshot that I would then transfer to my computer to use as a template. Okay, time to start our new document for this project. So the first thing you do is create a new document. Command N is the keyboard command to pull up the new document window. And I'm going to create a 2000 pixel by 2000 pixel square canvas. Hit create. And here we go. The first thing I'd like to do is create a set of guides. So I'm going to create guides on their own layer just to keep them isolated from my artwork so I don't accidentally delete them or move them. I like to just keep them separate like this. And on this layer, I'm going to create a square. So I'm going to use the rectangle tool, and when the keyboard pulls that up, I'm going to click once, and I'm going to create a 1000 pixel by 1000 pixel square. I'm then going to use the transform dialog box up here to set the X and Y axis to the center point, which on a 2000 pixel by 2000 pixel square canvas is 1000 pixels. And I now have a square sitting in the middle of my canvas. Right now it's currently a normal rectangle, it's a normal square. So it's not a guide, but we'll change that by hitting Command 5. And Command 5 makes guides out of the path that you have selected. So normally the default guides are just lines. I've created a square guide here in the middle of our canvas. You can go up to View, Guides, Make Guides with a path selected to create a guide out of it. But if you've watched any of my videos, you'll know that I'm a big supporter of using keyboard commands. It speeds up the workflow. So the next thing I'm going to do is create a vertical and horizontal guide. Hit Command R on the keyboard to pull up the rulers, and then drag out a guide and align it to the center. Horizontal and vertical guides, like so. And here we've got our guides set up for our document, all nicely contained on its own layer. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to import that reference image that we shot earlier from our sketch. So we're going to create a new layer, and we're going to call this template. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to place our template image in the document. So Command-Shift-P is the keyboard command to use place function, or you can find it up here, File, Place. Then you would navigate to where you've got your reference images stored on your hard drive and select it and place it. And then you're going to get this little icon here, and that would allow you to click and drag to define the size, or you can just click once and it will place it at full size. So here's our little robot illustration, and I want to roughly position it within my guides. Obviously my sketch I didn't do with rulers, so it's not going to be symmetrical, it's not going to be straight. This is just to give us a rough idea of what we're working towards here. So let's position it as best we can to fill the space. And keep in mind, because it's not symmetrical, you may want to find an ideal place to center it and then just kind of work on one side. Obviously, if you work here, my drawing is not perfectly centered, so this is just a rough idea to work towards. So once it's there in a spot where you're happy with its size and position, you can double click on the layer icon here in the layer palette, which pulls up the layer options, and turn on the template option. By default, it will probably drop down to 50% opacity. This is going to be a matter of personal taste. You can leave it at 100% opacity, but it can become distracting, so you might want to drop it down to 50 or lower. And here we go, we now have a template set up. So now that means when you start working on top of it and you're creating paths that have fills and strokes and whatnot, if you drop into outline mode, Command Y on the keyboard to do that, you're going to be able to manipulate your paths and your template image will stay visible and you can work on top of it this way. Okay, so now that your guides and template are set up, it's time to start building this thing. So let's create a new layer and name it line work. Like I mentioned earlier, it's good to keep everything organized. So in the line work layer, we're just going to create a series of basic lines and then the fills will come later. So there's a series of techniques that I'm going to use throughout this piece. So let's cover a few of those. The first thing we're going to do is work with the transform again feature. So I'm going to create one of these rivets up here using an ellipse. So I'm going to use the ellipse tool, L on the keyboard pulls that up, and hold down shift so that it constrains it to a circle, and I'm going to create this ellipse up here. Currently it has a stroke on it. I want to flip the stroke and fill. So Shift X is the keyboard command to do that, where you can click this little swap icon. And then I end up with my first rivet, and I want to create a series of them that follow this shape on the side of the robot's head. So to do that, what I'm going to do, holding down Shift and Option now, Shift will constrain the angle of our copy being created, so you can stick it to a 45-degree angle or 90. In this case, we'll go straight down, and then let go, and we've created a copy. With this copy still selected, if you hit Command D, that's the keyboard command for transform again, and if you've watched my channel, I use it all the time. Several times, and we now have a line of rivets down the side of the robot's head. I'm going to select all of these and group them together with Command G. Always handy to have these things grouped, because if you needed to come back in and move them later, you wouldn't want to pick up one by one and try to move them that way. But here we've got them grouped nicely together, and it's easy to move them. So that function, Command D, transform again, is going to get used throughout this project. Over here, we have the axle, and on the axle, I've kind of sketched out that I want a series of lines to be created. So let's do that Shift X again, and let's increase our stroke weight up to 3 points. So I like that as my thick stroke. And I'm going to use the pen tool, P on the keyboard, to pull that up. And I'm going to create a line that spans the edge of this, from edge to edge of this axle. When you're done drawing a path, you can either hit Escape or Command Shift A to deselect. Now I want the axle lines to be a thinner weight, so I'm going to reduce them down to 1. And I'm going to repeat the same process of holding down Option, Shift, and creating copies. And then Command D to transform again. I'm then going to select all of the lines inside of the axle, group them together, and then I can transform them and align them to the middle. And there's my axle. So like I said, lots of techniques in here are going to get repeated. now that I've covered those off, I probably won't tell you again what key command I'm doing as I'm putting it together. There's an alternate method for creating a series of lines that I'm going to use over here on the hub at the end of the wheel. So first of all, let's create our wheel using the rectangle tool. M on the keyboard pulls that up. I pulls up the eyedropper so that you can select the stroke weight and color. And then let's transform that. So there's the basis of our wheel. And then here's going to be the basis of our hubcap. So I use basic shapes or the pen tool to get started, and then I'll go from there. In this case, I want to transform just these outer points. So I'm going to use a direct selection arrow. A on the keyboard will pull that up. I'm going to select both of these points. So I'm going to click on one and then shift click on the other one. And then I'm going to go Object, Transform, Scale. And I'm going to reduce the scale of just those 2 points down to 65%, and it will create that trapezoid shape that I was looking for. Sometimes it's easier than hand drawing just to create a rectangle and modify it in this way. A good note to make here in the transform dialog box while we're here is the scale, stroke, and effects button. If you have this turned on, if you do any transformation to a stroked object, the size of the stroke, the width of the stroke will be affected. But when this is turned off, you can scale things as you wish, up and down, and the stroke will stay consistent. So in this particular project, I want all my lines to be consistent. I want there to be a thick stroke and a thin stroke, and I don't want there to be a series of different stroke weights in between. So making sure that that radio button is checked off is a good thing. Okay, I'm also going to round off these corners. So direct selection arrow, round those off slightly, just so I don't have sharp edges. Same thing on this tire. Select the whole thing, round off all 4 corners at the same time. Now, back to that line work that I talked about. I want to create lines that run on this hubcap, but I don't want them just to be straight lines that are created with that transform and gain key command. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to create one line with the pen tool in the middle of this hub. And then I'm going to create a new line with the pen tool that roughly follows the angle of the upper part of this hub. And now I want a series of lines that kind of cascade from there. So I could go and do that manually and get pretty close, but they're not going to be perfectly even. But what I want is a nice, clean, evenly spaced set of lines. So to do that, I'm going to use the blend tool. I'm going to create a blend between these two shapes. I'm going to pick them both up and go Object, Blend, Make. And by default, the blend options are going to need to be adjusted. So go in here to blend options, and then change smooth color to specified steps. And then you can choose the number of steps that you want in here. If you just want one, hit preview, and you'll see that just one step has been blended perfectly in the middle of those 2 paths. But for this, let's try 2. That looks good. One thing to note here, if you go into outline mode, Command Y, you'll see over here where we created the copies, each one of these lines is an individual path. But here, the blend doesn't show up until you expand it. So with the blend selected, go Object, Expand, and hit OK. And now you have the lines create out of that. So handy to know, just in case you need to modify something. Say, for instance, your robot needed a longer line in one of these sections, you can modify that after you've expanded it. Now, another technique that's going to come up a lot in my tutorial here is reflection. So I've got the upper section of this hubcap created, and I want to reflect across this line and create a copy along the bottom. So I'm going to use the reflection tool, which can be found over here, or you can use O on the keyboard to pull it up. I'm then going to option click on this line because I want this to be where my reflection happens. I want to reflect across this plane. Now, it happened to be set up perfectly in the horizontal axis, but you may see something that looks like this and you think, oh no, it's broken. It just means that you're reflecting across the vertical axis when you wanted to, in fact, reflect across the horizontal axis. And then instead of hitting OK or Enter, what you want to do is make sure that you click Copy. And now the reflection has copied across that plane that you defined. So now your hubcap is complete. Okay, what can we cover now? How about the treads on the tires? So for treads like this, I used a cool technique that I kind of came up with on my own, just through trial and error, which was to create a rectangle. So we're going to create a small rectangle like this, and this will define one section of the tread. And then I want to hold Option and Shift to create a copy, and I want to make sure that the top of my copy aligns perfectly with the bottom. So you'll see that intersect that pops up there. Those are my smart guides. Command U, turn the smart guides on. And now if you go into outline mode, you'll see the top and bottom align perfectly. You don't want to have a gap for this. You want to make sure that those are aligning exactly on the same spot. With this rectangle still selected, hit Command D several more times, and you're creating the sections of the tire. I'm going to then select all of them, deselect the tire there because it got caught in my selection, and I'm just going to reduce the size of these to roughly about there. Now I'm going to open up my Pathfinder, and I'm going to use the Unite option, and it's going to unite all of these small rectangles into one larger rectangle. And you might say at this point, okay, well, it looks like a big rectangle. Why didn't you just create a rectangle that looked like this? Well, this rectangle is comprised of 4 points. There's a point on each of the corners and then nothing in the middle. This rectangle, because it was united from the series of smaller rectangles, has points at each one of those intersections where those smaller rectangles join together. And this is handy for creating the treads. So if you pick up these 2 points here, so you're clicking and dragging with the direct selection arrow, then holding Shift and selecting 2 points that alternate, like so. You can now drag the position of these, holding Shift so that they stay horizontal, to a spot that looks like that. And it creates this really cool zigzag pattern, which you can now use the direct selection arrow again and round off the corners. And it gives you that cool looking tread pattern, which we're then going to, you guessed it, drag out a copy and Command D to transform again. Now in my sketch, I had 3 copies, 3 little zigzags, but I like the idea of having 4 here. I think it makes the tire look cooler. So again, that comes back to the point that I made about the sketch being really rough and just you're using it as a general idea as you're building this. Now, I want to remove the line in between these treads here so that it looks like the treads are raised up off the tire. And there's a few ways to accomplish that. I think in the past I've shown you guys how to use the scissor tool, which I use a lot. In this case today, I'm going to use the shape builder. So I'm going to click and drag with my selection arrow and pick up the tire shape and the tread shapes. Then I'm going to go over here to the shape builder, which is Shift M on the keyboard to pull up quickly. By default, what it wants to do is add elements together. So you can add things like this, which works. But what I wanted to do in this case, because this is creating extra line work in here, was to actually just subtract those elements using the shape builder and the subtract feature. So if you hold down Option, you can now subtract the lines that get highlighted red. So we're going to do this on the bottom as well. And it subtracts those lines in the middle. And now if you look at this, you don't end up with all that extra line work tucked underneath your zigzags. You've just deleted the sections in the middle. And that's looking pretty cool. So now that my hubcap and axle and tire are all together, I'm going to group those and I'll be able to reflect them across my middle guide here, which I set up. So reflection tool, Option click to define the reflection point, and then change the axis to the vertical guide and hit copy. Now you can turn off your template to see how you're doing, and we've got some rivets and we've got some tires, and that's looking pretty cool. It's a good start. All right, so now that we've got the wheels set up, the rest of this character, it's all very straightforward. Lots of rectangles, squares, and very simple, very minimal work with the pen tool. So I'm going to put this into fast forward, build out this character, and get us on to the next step. So there you go. It's up to you how much detail you want to add at this point. You can see how I used my rough pencil sketch to get an idea of what form I wanted this character to take. And then in Illustrator, I refined that and added all the detail that I wanted in a much more organized geometric fashion. So this ends up looking much cleaner than what I was capable of doing with a pencil. But the idea is there. Okay, with the line work complete, it's time to start adding some color to this character. So I'll do that by duplicating my line work. So I drag the line work layer down and create a copy of it down here in this little icon. And then I'm going to rename it to Fill. I'm going to unlock it so that I can modify it, and I'm going to drag it beneath my line work. I'm going to select everything on the layer by pressing Command A, and I'm going to go up into my object menu and go Path, Outline Stroke. With everything outlined, I'm now going to be able to merge them together using the Pathfinder Unite option, which gives me one compound path for all my outlines. I could then go Object, Compound Path Release, and with the direct selection arrow, I'd like to pick up the outermost path and hit Delete twice. I'm going to turn off the line work so I can see what that actually did. And here you'll be able to see that all of the internal shapes inside that compound path have been left as their own filled paths now. You can pick these all up and define a lighter gray for them. So let's go to 210 across the board for a light gray. And then I'm going to turn the line work back on so you can see the effect that had. Now, for my characters, what I did was I would go through and I would define certain areas within the character as different shades of gray. I tried to keep it a pretty limited color palette. I think I had about 3, maybe 4 shades of gray that I used. And then a couple other colors, a couple blues and a couple oranges. So for this darker gray, let's go 110. And I like that. Now it's just a matter of going through your piece, selecting all the areas that you want to change color, and adding darker and lighter tones to define how your character looks. The thing that you need to know here is that you don't need to be confined to shapes that were created just by using the outlines. So for instance, I created vents by creating a new rectangular shape that I would use. Let's go somewhere about 185, I think will be good. 185, 185. So here's the basis of a vent. Then I'm going to pick up just the top 2 points, round them off with the rounding handles, and add another rectangle underneath. This one will be darker. Now I'll group this together, adjust the scale, and make a series of copies. And group them all together. So you don't need to be restricted to the line work that you created in the first step. You can add all kinds of extra detail in here, including maybe some highlights and some shadows. So on the ends of these fins here, I would add in extra rectangles that would create the effect of there being a bit of a highlight. Same thing on thin lines like this. You could add a tiny little thin line in beside, and that's going to just create a little bit of a bevel on the corner of some of these strokes. So now that I've shown you the basis of this, I'm going to go through and colorize this artwork the way I did with the rest of them, and I'll put it in fast forward so you don't get bored. So once you're done adding the fill to your outline, the last step is to create the background. So to do that, what you want to do is just drop in a new layer, call it background, and add a square to it that fills the canvas. In my case, I had a selection of different grays and oranges that I used as the background color, and then I added a couple technical details and typographic elements just to spice it up a bit. The last thing that I did on top of the background and underneath the fill was to add a double offset stroke or double offset path that kind of created the look of like a vinyl sticker. So to do that, I duplicated my line work again. I selected it. I outlined the stroke. I created a compound path. I released the compound path. I united all of those objects together. And then I offset the final path. So I came here, object, path, offset path. And for my thicker stroke, I think I came out about 25 pixels based on my canvas size. And I hit OK. So I like the way that that looks. Now it's time to add the thinner stroke. So I'm going to offset this again. Object, path, offset path. Now this one I only came out, I think 10 pixels. So it was a much thinner stroke. And then I filled that with white. And this creates a really cool, chunky looking robotic sticker effect, which I liked for my project. The one thing that you want to be aware of when using offset path is if there's any unusual little sections like this that are created. Sometimes this might have been closed off and you might have had a little extra orange triangle in there. And if that was the case, you could have used the direct selection arrow just to pick up that inside section of the compound path and hit delete twice to delete it. In this case, it's open. So what I would do just to maintain that even 10 pixel stroke all the way around is to artificially close this off. So just use the pen tool and create a shape that hides that section in there. Then obviously you would reflect this again across your middle axis. Hit copy. And visually it looks good, but I'm also a stickler for this kind of thing. So I would pick up the little fill section that I'm creating on both sides and the main path. And then I would use the unite option again, just to create one solid path out of it. That's then brought it to the front, so we can use the key command to send it to back again. Or again, it's in object, arrange, send to back. And that drops that in the background on this layer, which we could rename sticker. And now you're left with 4 distinct layers housing all of your elements, your line work, your fill, your sticker element, and your line work. So now if you need to come back and adjust anything, it's easy enough to isolate it, figure out what's going wrong, and then adjust it accordingly.
So that's it for today. Thanks for checking out the video. I really had a lot of fun putting this whole project together, the original series and this tutorial. I hope you found it useful, and if you stuck around to this point in the video, you probably have. And if that's the case, I'd appreciate it if you do all those things that YouTubers ask you to do, which is to give the video a thumbs up, leave a comment down below, and if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel. The support really does mean a lot. So that does it for me today. I gotta go find another project to start working on. If you have an idea for something that you'd like me to teach, leave a comment down below and I'll add it to my queue of things that I need to do. See you in the next one.